Hey everyone, welcome back to Blacklight TV. Today, we're diving into the wild and wonderful world of boxing. You know I love talking about fighting and boxing, and it's got some deep history. We're talking about some fun and lesser known facts, along with some old school rules that'll make you wonder how anyone survived back then. Seriously, some of this stuff is brutal. Get ready to have your mind blown, because we're about to throw down some serious boxing knowledge. Let's get started.
All right, so you hear this phrase all the time, throwing in the towel. It's everywhere, not just in fighting, but have you ever stopped to think about where it comes from? It's actually pretty brutal. We got to go back to the early 1900s, back when boxing was a bare-knuckle brawl. Fighters are going at it, blood's flying everywhere, and sometimes it's just too much. That's when a fighter's cornerman, you know, the guy in his corner, would literally grab a towel, usually a big dirty one, and chuck it right into the ring. I mean, can you imagine the scene? It was a desperate move, a way of saying, okay, enough is enough. My guy is getting destroyed out there. And just like that, the fight was over. It's crazy how something so simple became such a universal symbol of giving up, right?
All right, so we all know boxing gloves, right? Those big padded mitts that fighters use to pummel each other. You'd think they were invented to protect fighters' faces, make the sport a little less brutal, right? Well, you're wrong. This one blew my mind too when I first heard it. We're going back to the days of bare-knuckle boxing, which, let me tell you, was a whole different beast. Back then, fighters were breaking their hands all the time. I'm talking shattered knuckles, broken bones, the works. It was a real problem. So, they came up with this crazy idea: let's wrap their hands in something. The first gloves were basically just leather straps, not much padding at all. And you know what? It wasn't about protecting the other guy, it was about protecting the fighter's hands so they could keep fighting.
All right, folks, buckle up for this one. We're talking about the longest boxing match in history, and it's insane. It went down in 1893, Andy Bowen versus Jack Burke. These guys fought for over 7 hours straight. Can you imagine? 7 hours. That's longer than most UFC fight cards. And back then, they didn't have the same kind of time limits. These guys were just going at it, round after round. They fought 110 rounds, man. 110. By the end, they were both so exhausted they could barely stand. The referee called it a draw. I mean, what else could he do? It's just unbelievable, the kind of toughness and endurance those guys had. It's hard to even fathom fighting for that long. This wasn't some sparring session, this was a bare-knuckle brawl.
Muhammad Ali, the greatest of all time, wasn't just known for his lightning-fast jabs and fancy footwork. The man was a master of trash talk, and it turns out he had a secret weapon: pebbles. Yeah, you heard that right. Ali would practice his legendary trash talk with pebbles in his mouth. It sounds crazy, but it's true. He got the idea from ancient Greek orators who used this technique to improve their diction and projection. Imagine young Ali, walking around, mouth full of rocks, just spitting fire. I'm so fast that last night I turned off the light switch in my hotel room and got into bed before the room was dark. This unconventional method helped him develop incredible breath control and enunciation. It's no wonder he could talk circles around his opponents both inside and outside the ring. Ali's trash talk was legendary. He'd get into his opponent's head, predict the round he'd knock them out in, and then go out and do it. He was a showman, a poet, a master of psychological warfare. And it all started with a mouthful of pebbles.
So, you think Mike Tyson hitting the speed bag is impressive? Imagine Rocky Marciano, undefeated champ 49-0, pounding on a bag filled with rocks. Rocks, man. This wasn't some gimmick. The dude trained like he was preparing for war. They didn't have fancy gyms back then, no cryotherapy, no kale smoothies, just grit, raw power, and a bag of freaking rocks. You gotta respect the dedication, the sheer intensity of this guy. It's like something out of a David Goggins book, but real, man. Marciano wasn't the biggest guy, but he hit like a truck, and that rock-filled bag, that was his secret weapon. It's no wonder he retired undefeated. I mean, who wants to step in the ring with a guy who spends his days punching rocks? That's just insane, dude. It's like fighting a human weapon forged in the fires of some old-school boxing gym. And no wonder they called him the Rock.
1939. We're talking pre-internet, pre-social media, heck, even pre-color TV. But you know what they did have? Boxing. And for the first time ever, people could watch two guys duke it out on their television sets. Can you imagine the excitement? This was a game changer, man. Lou Nova versus Max Baer, broadcast live for the world to see. It was a glimpse into the future, a future where every punch, every drop of sweat could be beamed directly into people's living rooms. Now, the technology was primitive, the picture quality grainy, but it didn't matter. This was history in the making. It was the birth of televised boxing, and it paved the way for the pay-per-view events we know and love today. From that moment on, boxing was never the same. It became more accessible, more popular, and ultimately a global phenomenon. All thanks to that one fight, broadcast on a handful of flickering black and white screens.
All right, you've heard of Mike Tyson biting ears. Have you heard about John L. Sullivan, the first heavyweight champ, knocking out a horse? Yeah, you heard me right, a horse. This dude was a different breed, a true bare-knuckle brawler. Back then, they didn't have weight classes or time limits. Imagine that, no rounds, just two guys slugging it out until one of them couldn't stand anymore. And Sullivan, he was the king of that world. He was known for his power, his iron fist, and apparently his ability to knock out large farm animals. Now, the story goes that Sullivan was challenged to hit a horse, and being the badass that he was, he accepted. One punch, that's all it took. Sent that horse straight to the ground. Now, I don't condone animal cruelty, and this was a different time, but you gotta admit, it's a hell of a story. It's like something out of a tall tale, but it just goes to show you the kind of power these old-time boxers possessed.
All right, folks. Can you imagine a boxing match where the rounds just kept going and going? I'm not talking about a 12-round slugfest. I'm talking about rounds that could last for 20 minutes or more. That's how it was back in the day before the Marquis of Queensberry came along and said, hey, maybe we need some rules. Back then, they fought under the London prize ring rules. And those rules said a round only ended when a fighter hit the canvas. Can you imagine the endurance those guys had? They were like human punching bags, just absorbing punishment until one of them couldn't take it anymore. It's crazy to think about how different the sport was back then. It was brutal, man. You think getting knocked down for a 10 count is rough? Try getting pummeled for 20 minutes straight. These guys were tough, man. I mean, they didn't have all the fancy training techniques and recovery methods we have today. They just went out there and fought until they couldn't fight anymore.
So you think boxing is all about the hands? Think again, my friend. Back in the day, it was more like a street fight in a ring. I'm talking about the early 1700s under Broughton's rules. This wasn't your grandpa's boxing, man. They were allowed to kick. Can you imagine Tyson Fury throwing a roundhouse kick in the middle of a fight? It'd be absolute chaos. But back then, it was all part of the game. They could kick, grapple, throw each other around. It was basically like early MMA. They didn't have all these rules and regulations we have today. It was just two dudes in a ring trying to beat the crap out of each other using whatever means necessary.
All right, folks, let's talk about weight classes. You know, those things that make sure a flyweight doesn't get squashed by a heavyweight. Yeah, those didn't exist in the early days of boxing. It was a free-for-all. Imagine Manny Pacquiao stepping into the ring with Deontay Wilder. It would be a massacre. But back then, that was just another Tuesday night. They didn't care about weight differences. Big dudes, small dudes, it didn't matter. Everyone fought everyone. It's crazy to think about the mismatches that must have happened. Can you imagine being a 150-pound fighter and having to step into the ring with a 250-pound monster? Talk about a size disadvantage.
Can you imagine a boxing match with no judges? That's how it used to be, man. Back in the day, there were no scorecards, no point systems, none of that. It was a much simpler, more brutal time. The only way to win a fight was to knock your opponent out cold, or beat them so badly they couldn't continue. It was a real test of endurance, heart, and the ability to take a punch. Think about that for a second. You're in the ring, slugging it out, and there's no one keeping score. The pressure is on to finish the fight, to make a statement. It's crazy to think about how much the sport has changed, but you gotta respect the raw intensity of those early bare-knuckle brawls.
We all know the 10-second count in boxing, right? A fighter gets knocked down and the ref starts counting. But it wasn't always like that. Back in the day, a knockdown fighter had a full 30 seconds to recover. Can you imagine that? 30 seconds to shake off a punch that would put most people to sleep. It's like a whole different world. The fighters back then were tough as nails. They had to be, and the fights were longer and more grueling because of it. They'd just keep coming at each other, round after round. It's no wonder those old-time boxers were considered some of the toughest athletes on the planet. They were built different, man.
All right, so picture this. You're about to watch a bare-knuckle boxing match, right? But forget about the ring, man. Back in the day, they didn't need no ropes to define the fighting area. These dudes were just going at it wherever they could. Can you imagine the chaos? Fighters scrambling through the crowd, spectators getting way too close to the action. It's like a mosh pit, but with way more face punching. It's wild, man. And you gotta think, without a designated fighting space, these fights could go on forever. They'd be chasing each other through fields, down streets, maybe even into a pub for a quick pint between rounds. It was a different world, man. A much wilder, more unpredictable world of boxing.
So we all know gambling's a big part of combat sports, right? But back in the day, it wasn't just about betting on the winner. Oh no, it was way more intense than that. The rules of the fight, how long it lasted, it was all influenced by the bets being placed. Can you imagine that? Fighters basically becoming pawns in these high-stakes gambling matches. Hey, I'll give you 10-1 odds he doesn't make it past the 5th round if we allow groin shots. It's crazy, man. It's like a real-life fight club with way higher stakes and probably way more corruption. It makes you wonder how many fights were actually won fair and square back then. It's a rabbit hole, man. A deep, dark, and probably bloody rabbit hole.
And there you have it, folks, some of the most fascinating and bizarre facts from the world of boxing. We're talking bare-knuckle brawls, fights without rings, and gambling that would make your head spin. If you enjoyed this wild ride through boxing history, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Blacklight TV for more mind-blowing content. And let me tell you, we've got some crazy stuff lined up. Until next time, stay curious, my friends.